John sir, shall we start, John sir?
Yes, sir, I'll start.
Yes, sir. Good evening, participants. I welcome you all for this 5-week series on
Good evening, sir.
endowment lecture on literary criticism by Mr. A. John Paul Bubadi, who is working as an assistant professor in Sri Krishna Adithya College of Arts and Science. Now I welcome Madam Aishwarya to give introduction about the speaker.
A very good evening to everyone. I once again welcome you all for the Faculty Endowment Lecture Series, Session 5, entitled as The Enduring Legacy of Classical Literary Criticism. Our guest speaker for today's session is Mr. A. John Paul Bhubati, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Sri Krishna Adithya College of Arts and Science. He has completed his UG, PG, and MPhil in English Language and Literature from St. Xavier's and St. John's College, Tirunelveli. He has got more than 14 years of teaching experience in various colleges in and around Tamil Nadu. He has participated and presented papers in various national and international seminars and conferences. He has also cleared UGC NET examination, and with his expertise in literary criticism and theory, he has also helped many students to clear UGC NET exam. With the help of his coaching, many have cleared NET and JRF as well. We are elated to have you as a resource person for the today's session, sir. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Um, so, good evening, everyone. I welcome you to my first lecture on the enduring legacy of classical literary criticism. And today, we'll focus on Plato and Aristotle. Now, Plato and Aristotle are of two most important figures in classical literary criticism. And the classical literary criticism is the a study of literature from ancient Greek and Roman worlds, and it had its own profound impact on Western thought and culture. And in this lecture, I'll discuss the main ideas of Plato and Aristotle's literary criticism and their contribution to literary criticism. And I'll also try to show how their ideas have influenced the way we read and interpret literature today. I think my screen is visible. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes, sir. It is visible, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Literature can be enjoyed methodically and casually. When we do this methodical study, and it is criticism, right? So, a critic, when he does a methodical study, he becomes a critic, and he is becoming an ideal reader. So, as being an ideal reader, a critic travels much in the realms of goal, and he brings a trained judgment on whatever he reads. So, in this aspect, a criticism to a critic or work of art for a critic is not good or not bad, and no work of art is enjoyable or unenjoyable, and no work of art is meaningful or meaningless, because a critic is doing a thorough examination. So, a criticism is born out of questioning. For example, when we are reading a novel, we might ask ourselves some questions like, are the characters believable, or the plots well structured, or is the writing clear and engaging? See, by asking these kind of questions, we are engaging in critical thinking and developing our own understanding of any work of art that we read. So, criticism is born of questioning. And when we question something, we are asking ourselves why it is the way it is, and whether it could be better, or how it could have been better presented, So this is a process, and in this process of critical thinking, or this kind of process of critical thinking is very essential for a criticism, because it allows us to identify the strengths and weakness of work, and to offer a constructive feedback or something. And in terms of criticism, each age has its own limitation. We have various different types of age in literary history, and each age in literary history has its own limitations. And these limitations may be caused by various factors like social cultural norms, or technological advancements, the political climate. The political climate plays a very important role in making the limitations in literary history. For example, in a totalitarian society, writers are often censored and they are limited in what they can write about. So, this can surely affect, or this can surely make a great impact on creativity and innovation in literature. So, in literature, all the age has its own limitations. When we talk about all this kind, um, the literature or criticism, it should have been started with the ancient Greece, right? And we have great writers, great tragedies. Tragedies from the contributions of the writers which I have mentioned in my slide, like Sophocles and Euripides, right? And they're all very great literarians in ancient Greece, especially in the 5th century BC. And Aeschylus, who was considered to be the father of tragedy, right? And his contributions are great. So in the realm of the great literary aspect in Greece, especially the masters, Greek masters, Plato and Aristotle, and they play a very important role in making criticism a profound or methodological judgment. When we talk about Plato and Aristotle, and they make a path, they make a way for all the other literary aspects, right? In the Victorian era, when we talk about Victorian era, and we study that literature has been divided into two aspects: art for art's sake and art for life's sake. And these two different streams have originally started with Plato and Aristotle. When in course of this lecture we would see how Plato advocated for art for life's sake and how Aristotle advocated for art for art's sake. And in Plato, we are not sure about his birth, and but it is recorded that certainly he died in 348 BC, and he was one of the most celebrated disciples of Socrates, right? And the time in which Plato lived was very different. When we divide Plato's life into two, half of his lifetime was spent during war. So Plato considered, uh, being a profound or a celebrated disciple of Socrates, Plato considered that society need moral. Without moral, a society cannot flourish. And that's why Plato started arguing that art should consist of moral ideas. Only moral ideas should be the end of art, right? And in most of his philosophical investigations would be like dialogues, in dialogue format. In the dialogue, Plato mostly involve his master Socrates, as Socrates answers to the questions of his students. So one of the most very famous work in the Republic, in which the most of the point that we are going to discuss in Plato's contribution, in Republic, Socrates himself is playing a role, right? And they are talking about virtue, and they are talking about moral, they are talking about an ideal society. And when each characters are discussing various elements of, in their perspective of moral society or a better society, Socrates will give a very clear picture about what should be a moral society, what should be an utopian ideology. And in all the works, Plato followed the twin standards that I have mentioned in this slide: is concern on individual and concern on society. So with these two ideologies, Plato prepared all his works, all his ideologies. When Plato talks about art, his view of art is entirely different. He says, art is a product of inspiration. A writer inspires of a natural object, and out of that inspiration, a writer writes. A poet prepares his poetry, a poet makes his poetry out of inspiration. But his idea about art is different. As he says, as literature is an art, like other artistic ideas like painting, sculpture, and others, Plato deserves, or I mean, Plato makes that art deserves the first consideration. And he says, ideas are ultimate reality. And these statements are in his Republic, the work Republic. He says, ideas are ultimate reality, and all the things are conceived as ideas before they take their practical shapes. Like, for example, if there is a tree is nothing more than a concrete embodiment of its image and idea. And if you talk about a rose, or if you talk about a table, a material, a table is actually originally table is an idea in the mind of a carpenter, and that has come into existence. So to Plato, ideas are original, ideas are real, and things are copies of ideas. So it is once removed from reality. So he considers ideas are real, and things are, since it is copies of ideas, since it is out of ideas it has been into this existence, and he says these are removed from reality. And in terms of art, art is a copy of copy. Say for example, if a poet writes about rose, rose ideas are original, and rose is a copy of the idea. And when a poet writes about rose, he copies a copy, which is already a copy, right? So art is a copy of copy, and so it is twice removed from reality. Now, art, literature, painting, sculpture, they are all they are reproduced, but in first they are reproduced as words. In next they are reproduced in colors, and finally they are reproduced in stone, maybe in case of sculpture. So it merely copies a copy. So it is twice removed from reality, right? And things themselves being imperfect copies of some ideas from which they are springing, and their reproductions in art must be more imperfect still. So and this is the reason why Plato rejected poetry and Plato rejected most forms of art. So to his consideration, when a copy is not original, when they are all removed from reality, and they should be more imperfect, right? So this is his theory of ideas, right? And Plato is most famous for his theory of ideas in his Republic. And when we talk about why Plato condemned poetry, there are a few reasons, right? For the same reason, like when things are copies of idea, and art is a copy of copy, when it becomes imperfect copies, that is the first reason for his attack on art, or his condemnation of poetry. And with the twin standards which I already mentioned, he finds that uh, uh, these kind of imperfect copies may corrupt a society. So and he makes three grounds for his condemnation. One is the poetic inspiration. When he talks about when we talk about poetic inspiration, a poet writes about something, and it is not because he has thought of that idea long over, which he has to say, but what he does is he is inspired of something. So just because of that inspiration, he makes that poetry, and this is not put into the test of reasons, right? So poetry therefore cannot take the shape of philosophy. Philosophy is one point of, I mean, one kind of art that shapes a society. So as I already mentioned in the beginning, when Plato spends half of his lifetime in war, and he wanted society with full of morals, so he considers philosophy as the highest thing, and art corrupts individual, and so the corrupted individuals are again corrupting the society. So he considers that poetry or art cannot take the place of philosophy. And see, guided chiefly by the impulse of that moment of inspiration, a poet cannot make philosophical ideas, a poet cannot involve philosophical ideas into his work of art. So in the ideal commonwealth in which Plato, that is what Plato is talking about in his Republic. They are talking about an ideal world, an utopian society, where Plato says there is no space for this kind of non-idealistic persons, like poets who are corrupting society. Second point that he condemns poetry is, the reason is the emotional appeal of poetry. And he says, Plato says, poetry appeals to emotions, right? Because poetry is a product of inspiration, and so it appeals to the emotions, so it affects the emotions rather than reasons, right? The heart rather than the intellect. So art, which is considered to be the beautiful form by other scholars, is not considered the great by Plato, because art pictures life. So therefore the characters, scenes, situations, they are all overpowering their emotions, and they are holding the reason, right? Reasons of individual. They are making the readers or the audience as prisoners, right? They are overpowering the emotions, and they are holding the reasons of the audience or readers. So now emotions, as being just being impulses of the moment, like the poetic inspiration, cannot be such safe guides as reason, right? So say for example, if there is any tragic poetry, when for giving the tragic flaw, a poet may make a lot of inspiring aspects into it, and that arrests the reason of a reader or a viewer and an audience, set of audience, and it corrupts them, right? And so in these reasons, in Republic, in Plato's work Republic, he condemns poetry. Then he talks about the non-moral character, right? This is his final reason for condemnation of poetry. So he indicates poetry for its lack of concern with morality. He considers that poetry have a very lack of concern with morality. It has no sense of morality. So in the treatment of life, it treats both virtue and vice alike. Poetry considers, or poets consider, poets treat the virtue and goodness and bad, positive and negative, both are considered, both are treated same, right? Sometimes when virtue or vice considered alike, treated alike, the viewers or readers maybe get into that corruption, right? And he, for example, Plato in Republic, he talks about Homer, right? And he talks about how tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, they all corrupt society. And he wanted a dialectical method to be followed by scholars in utopian society, which means everything should be reasoned, right? Everything should be questioned. As I mentioned in my first slide, criticism is born out of questioning. Plato comes with the same attitude. He says that only when an individual questions society, only when individuals questions their leaders, right, their path makers, they will find the right way to, right way to lead their life. So with all these points, Plato condemns poetry, and he says pleasure cannot be a function of poetry, because the function of poetry is not uh, is not accepted actually, right? In an utopian society, when for poetry functions to deliver a pleasure, when a poetry functions to deliver aesthetic aspects to society, there is no space for philosophical ideas, there is no space for moralistic ideas, right? General morality cannot happen in society. So Plato feels that the function of poetry is not pleasure giving, it should be moral teaching, right? Pleasure, when a poet or an artist has pleasure as the highest kind, he ranks low in the method or the values that Plato scales to consider an artist. A poet is a good artist only when he delivers message, only when he is a good teacher. Plato considers him as a good artist, right? And for that he says truth as test of poetry. He makes that statement in Republic. He's telling that truth should be the test of poetry, because only when truth is test of poetry, there can be a measure whether the poetry has a proper message, a proper moral in it. So ultimately, Plato rejects poetry or any form of art which delivers pleasure. So Plato wanted morals, right? He cannot conceive of art as diverse from morals. When art concerns by Plato, when Plato concerns about art, he just talks about an art should consist of moral teaching, right? That should be the end of poetry or any form of art. Then we come to the perspective on drama. When he is commenting on drama, and he talks about some of his contemporary dramatists who are good at making dramas. And he says, when the same kind of attitude he follows when he talks about drama, he says drama appeals to the baser instincts, it manipulates, it appeals to the baser instincts, right? When a dramatist is performing, right, when characters are performing, and in order to please the audience, a dramatist will make uh, uh, scenes like quarrels, lamentations, right? Mostly that will happen in tragedy, and the cries of beasts or thunders, right? That happens in comedy. So all these kind of feelings, I mean, all these kind of pleasurable aspect, they arouse their baser instincts, right? Then they appeal to the baser instincts, so of which they themselves will be ashamed in normal life. When mean action of a great person is talked about, the audience will automatically have a feel that the same kind of deeds, the same kind of activities they have done in their real life, so they will be ashamed in normal life. So what happens is it leads to a bad taste, right, and laxity in discipline. So what happens then? uh, Plato appeals such kind of, I mean, Plato rejects that such kind of artist, right? Such kind of artistic works. So such plays, therefore, Plato will have ruthlessly censored. He says in his utopian society, in his ideal society, there is no space for such kind of writers or such kind of writing. Then he talks about the impersonation, and mainly he talks about the effects of impersonation. He says that when an actor, maybe by birth he must be a good natured man, when he takes up a criminal uh, character in acting, what happens then? When he repeatedly performing criminal actions on stage, the evil qualities will enter into his own nature, and so automatically what happens? He is corrupted. The role that he is playing on stage may be a chance, may have a chance, or may be the reason for the self corruption, right? So Plato says that this kind of effects of impersonation may happen, and that can corrupt a good individual into a worse person, right? So these kind of same qualities or same kind of action can be stimulated in the character of that person, and he may try to perform that in his real life. So this kind of negative impacts a drama can make. And third point is he talks about the pleasures of tragedy and comedy, right? When he talks about the tragic and comic pleasures, when we see a act on stage, right, and he makes a question like, what is in a painful sin when it causes pleasure? Maybe I can give you one example here. When Vadivelu he acts on screen, when he comes to screen, what happens? A few characters will surround that character, Vadivelu's character, and they will beat him, and out of which the audience laugh. So what Plato says in this is, when a character is beaten up by other people, what feel should be evoked as pity. But instead of that, our heterogeneous feeling is wrongly evoked. Instead of pity, we are amused. So he says that this tragic and comic pleasure may corrupt a society. It may wrongly evoke the heterogeneous feeling, right? We have feelings like anger, envy, grief, and a lot more, right? So in no doubt, Plato says that this kind of comic or tragic pleasure may wrongly evoke that heterogeneous feel, right? The form of laughter may arise when actually a pitiful feeling should happen, right? And maybe in on stage, a coward behaving as a brave man, right? Or when a fool behaves as a wise man, what happens then, right? We are again, our heterogeneous feeling is wrongly evoked. So for all these reasons, Plato rejects drama too, right? So this is what he, I mean, in these ways he observes drama. Then he also talks about style. When he talks about style, he says for a good art, right? For a good art, and here I have mentioned as for good speech, because Plato and Aristotle both talk about rhetoric as well as writing. Rhetoric is very famous. I mean, rhetoric was one of the famous art at that time. So they are making lots of ideas about rhetorics, right? When he talks about style, he says that the essential part of good speech is, right? First, a good speaker should have a thorough knowledge of subject, right? He should know what he is talking about. right? When he does not know what he is talking about, and he has no a proper mean to explain to the listeners, right? So, but this alone cannot make a successful speaker. And the second point he makes it here is he should impress the readers. He should impress the listeners. A speech has to impress the hearers, right? As a written work is impressing the readers, a speech should impress the hearers, the people who are listening. So, a speaker must have the art of speaking, right? And this is a natural gift. He says art of speaking is a natural gift, but it doesn't mean that the people who are trying for uh, rhetorics, they cannot get this art of speaking. This can be acquired by consistent practice. This is what Plato makes. And third point he talks about when he talks about style is he should know about the audience, right? He should know about the audience, and that is human psychology. And for that he should make a natural sequence, which means a proper a proper beginning, a proper middle, and proper end. When this sequence is wrongly arranged, and there is a chance of misunderstanding, and there may be uh, may, there may be a chance of misdeliverance of ideas, right? So the same style Plato wanted for a rhetoric person, for the art of speaking, he implies the same points for art of writing poetry. So in Republic, Plato suggests that for the ideal society, who is needed is a writer who is having all these kind of capabilities. A writer who can make, who can have in the art of speaking, and who can make a proper sequence in his art, and who understands the audience and delivers what is expected. So according to Plato, in his time, during his time, what was expected was moral, right? So to Plato, uh, uh, he owes much to the poetry, and he makes lots of theoretical ideas to poetry. But he says that since poetry is a mimetic idea, that is imitation. Maybe he talks about inspiration, same as imitation. Since it is imitation, it tries to imitate the nature, it tries to imitate the life, but what happens at the end is when it wrongly evokes the feel, or when it makes that's kind of poetic or tragic or comic pleasure, right? And individual or society may get into corruption, right? And they maybe get corrupted. So for various reasons, Plato rejects poetry, and Plato rejects all forms of art. But in a way, Plato also suggests, or Plato makes a way, right? What can be a good poetry, right? With these ideas, his disciple or his student Aristotle comes now to the scene. And Aristotle lived between 382 BC and 322 BC, and is the most distinguished disciple of Plato, right? And we have list of works in Aristotle contribution to Greek literary aspects, and mainly we are going to talk about his poetics, which he dedicated for the art of poetry. Maybe I have given a very small idea about the poetics. It is divided into 26 chapters, and actually these are the summaries of lectures Aristotle delivered at various times. And there is no proper record whether Aristotle recorded all this or his students recorded and made into a compiled work. And there is also a saying that Aristotle has actually planned to make two books as poetics, and the later book was not, may not, it is not available. So there is a talk like might have been missed, or Aristotle had not completed writing. So most of the points discussed in poetics are about tragedy, and he also dedicated some of the chapters to other forms of work like epic. He also talks about comedy. He also talks about um, the diction of poetry, the presentation, right, the constituent parts, what an art must have, all this about. And in many times, Aristotle makes a comment like this will be discussed later, and the elaborated point will be discussed later in the second book. When since that book is not available, and we are limited in understanding. But Aristotle makes a very clear picture about art and the forms of art, because Plato, the master of Aristotle, when he made lots of questions about art, poetry, the existence of art, right, and the role of art in human life, Aristotle tries to answer all the questions of Plato, and he also makes a clear understanding, right? He also gives a clear understanding to the readers or the people how art should be observed or how art should be uh, uh, engaged in a life. And when he talks about poetry, unlike Plato, Aristotle says that art is a product of imitation. He says art is not a form which comes out of inspiration, because inspiration is a common element. Any normal human being can have inspiration. When we look at a rose, a beautiful rose, we are inspired. When we look at a great personality, we are inspired. When we read a good book, right, which gives uh, 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 maybe which gives a sense of good feel, we are inspired, right? When we are listening to a master, when we are listening to our teachers, we are inspired, and we are not becoming poets, we are not becoming artists. So Aristotle makes a clear statement that art is a product of imitation, and he also says that art presents or what represents what is present or what is past, what happened. And he says art is explaining what is believed to be, and art is also explaining what is ideal, right? And this is what Aristotle's consideration is. So he is making lots of contrary to his master, right? When he, especially when he talks about poetry, and he wants to make a distinguishment between poetry and history, by which he tries to explain how he is different from his master Plato, and he also tries to explain Plato's rejection of poetry and how it should be observed. And he says that poetry is different and history is different. While he compares poetry and history, he says the poet and historians differ not by their writing in verse or in prose. The true difference is that poet or historian, right? One relates what has happened, and the other what may happen, right? Historians, what they do is they write what has happened in the past, whereas a poet writes what may happen in future. So according to Aristotle, poet is a foreseer, right? Poet is a grand or great master who can talk about the future. So in that aspect, he says the function of poetry. Here he is completely contradicting his master's idea. When Plato says the end of poetry is moral teaching, Plato says end of poetry or end of art is pleasure giving. So this is what I mentioned in the beginning, right? When we talked about the Victorian element, art for art's sake and art for life's sake. This is where it started. When Plato suggested the end of art, end of poetry is moral teaching, that is the beginning of art for life's sake. When Aristotle says that end of art, end of poetry is pleasure giving, that is the beginning point, starting point of art for art's sake, right? And when he talks about the function of poetry, he says poetry should give pleasure, because there is also another perspective that we can look this point about. So as I said, Plato's lived half of his life in wartime. He wanted his society to be filled with moral, so that people can lead a good life. But Aristotle's time is different. Aristotle's time was complete peace. He observed peace. There was no war. So when a society lives in peace, which means they are not lacking moral, right? What they lack maybe more, pleasure giving, pleasure giving aspects. So Aristotle wanted art to teach or art to give pleasure, right? And he also accepts that art appeals to emotions, right? And this does not corrupt an individual, but what it makes is the emotions which are aroused with a view to their purgation and catharsis, right? And everybody has occasions of fear and pity in life, right? It is not that only when he looks at an art, only when he reads an art, he is getting to that pity or fear, right? In every aspect we get into that point. So he says that tragedy or any form of performance which is happening on stage, it's an art that transmutes these disturbing emotions into the calm of mind, right? When a viewer is watching a tragic uh, drama on stage, when he looks at characters who are suffering for his mean actions, or who are suffering for their fatal work, when we look at those, when we get the tragic flaw, our emotions are touched, and we know we are given a proper understanding how we should behave in our life, or how we should make our life when we get such kind of feel, we get such kind of ideas, right? So with these points, he observes tragedy, right? He talks about tragedy, and mainly he talks about the origin of tragedy, right? In poetics, he talks about the origin of tragedy. He says that uh, tragedy must have been originated from epic. And he also makes another statement like comedy must have been originated from satire. So he says that poetry can hold up a mirror to society and show both good and bad, right? And there is no difference, right? Noble actions of good men and the mean actions of bad men, both are projected in poetry, or both are projected in tragedy, right? Where the noble actions of good men, that is what tragedy is, and mean actions of bad men, that is comedy, right? So usually when we see epic and satire, right, these two different artistic aspects deal the same, right? So epic and tragedy are superior to satire and comedy, right? That's what he makes. I mean, that's what the statement he makes in poetics. He says that comedy or satire, they are inferior to epic and tragedy, right? In a way that, because the tragic flaw gives more understanding. Then when he talks about the characteristics of tragedy, he says tragedy is an imitation of an action which is serious and complete. I have given the exact statement what Aristotle gives in his Poetics. Like it goes like, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete in the form of action, not of narrative, right? Through pity and fear and their purgation of these emotions, right? And this is what Aristotle makes. See, by serious actions, Aristotle means a kind of a story, a plot of suffering which is exciting the pity and fear, and the action which are implied in, or which are mentioned in the drama, tragedy, the action comprises all kind of human activities, like the deeds, thoughts, feelings, everything is comprised. So it should be a complete or self-contained thing. So what is properly expected in a tragedy is, in its characteristics, it should have a proper beginning, it should have a proper middle, and a proper end. So a proper beginning is because the audience or the reader does not need to be told anything to understand the story. I can give you one example here. Like we would have heard about um Sophocles, Oedipus the King, right? A greatest epic, Oedipus the King. You know the story of Oedipus the King, right? But the poem, epic, starts from the point when Oedipus has got the news that he was the one who murdered his father and married his mother. So for his action, he comes out of his palace, because people are waiting outside his palace what their new king is going to do. And Oedipus comes out of his palace. He took his dagger, plucked his own eyes, and he walked in uh, in the midst of the crowd. Right? The backstory is already told. That is not delivered in the epic. So that's what he makes, right? So a tragedy or epic, when we talk about, it should have a proper beginning, so that the reader does not need to be told anything about the story. They don't need anything to understand the story in the beginning. So if something more is required to understand the story, then beginning gives an unsatisfactory feeling, right? So he says that, Aristotle says that there should be a proper beginning and proper middle. In course of action, readers or audience can understand what is happening, and the proper beginning and proper middle they form a proper end. So if any play, in the beginning can put the middle or the end, if the middle at the beginning or the end at the last, if this kind of wrong sequence are made, there cannot be a clear understanding. And then he talks about plot, or how a plot should be, right? Or he says that when he talks about tragedy, this is where epic and tragedy differs. Epic has no limitation. And an epic, a poet can write any number of lines in his epic. He can give any kind of description, right? Maybe while for introducing the hero of epic, he can make hundreds of lines. He can describe the physique, he can describe the situation, how he appears, or he can describe the birth. He can make a backstory of his birth. Anything he can make. But in case of tragedy, it should have a reasonable length. Reasonable length in the sense a length which can be easily embraced by the memory, right? An audience should have the character in their memory for a long time. So for that, a reasonable length is needed. Then he talks about the artistic ornaments like rhythm, harmony, and song, and these are all common qualities of artists through which they make their art great, right? And then he talks about the form. While he talks about the form, he says that the structure of plot is important, right? Where he brings it to the constituent parts of tragedy. There are six constituent parts of tragedy he makes. One is plot, right? Character, second. Thought, third. Diction, song, and spectacle. So these are the six ingredients Aristotle makes, right, for a good tragedy. And for the first four, plot, character, thought, plot, character, and thought. These three are the medium through which the action employed, right? Then diction, which means presentation. Song and spectacle are artistic ornaments, like stage representation, right? The way it is projected, how the characters are created, all that. See, plot here is the arrangement of incidents, which I already mentioned that it should have a proper beginning, proper middle, and proper end. And the character, second point, that is second constituent part, which means that it determines the qualities of men, qualities of characters. Then thought, here it means what a character thinks, right? When he talks about character, he says that character determines the qualities of men, right? In tragedy, or tragedy is written not merely to imitate men, but to imitate men in action. That is what the point is, right? So it is by the deeds of the characters, it is performed before every eyes. So the deeds that the character deals, right, that matter more than the character, right? Then follows thought, or what character thinks or feels during his career in the play. So it reveals the speech, right? It reveals itself in speech. And plot imitates action, character imitates men, and so the thought imitates mental emotions and reactions. So with all these points, he comes to diction, how it is presented, right? Diction means presentation, the ornament, right? How it is presented. And song, the artistic ornament, of which the means of expressions, right? The means of thoughts in general, how it is explained, all that. Finally, it talks about the spectacle. Spectacle in the sense, the stage representation, how powerful images are created in background and things, and through which the other five ingredient parts of tragedy are explained. Then he talks about the structure of plot, right? He says that plot is the soul of tragedy. If the plot is not properly created, the tragedy, the drama cannot have soul. So for that, he needs an artist needs an artistic arrangement quality, right? It should have unity of action, unity of time, unity of place. Maybe I can give you a very simple and practical examples of these three: unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. So unity of action means a play should have a single central action. And this does not mean that there can be no subplots or secondary characters, but unity of action means that all of the elements of the play should be connected to one central action, and that should contribute to the development, right? When he talks about this unity of action in poetics, he says that a tragedy should have a single object, right? And it may have some component objects, like component incidents may be there. And all that component incidents should be firmly compacted into one point, right? So that the whole appears. And when one component incident is removed, the plot is dislocated. So he makes number of reasons why unity of action is important in drama, right? Maybe like unity of action helps to create a sense of focus. Audience may get a sense of focus when unity of action is there, and when the audience knows that all of the events in the play are leading towards one single goal or one single action, it becomes easier for them to follow the story, and maybe they can easily understand what the dramatist's intention is. Then unity of action also helps to build a kind of suspense and excitement, right? And if there are many subplots and they are all having different ideas, there will be lots of suspenses, there will be lots of excitements, so that cannot give a proper understanding of a play. So when unity of action is there, when one single action is mainly concentrated, right, if the audience knows that every scene is necessary for the development of central action, there will be more eagerness, right, in audience mind to see what happens next. Then finally, the point is unity of action can also help to create a sense of catharsis, that is the emotional release, right? Audience will have the catharsis, they can release their emotion, which Aristotle already suggested how art works to, or how art helps the audience to release their emotions, right, which is the central action. Then maybe example, you can take Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, right, where the plot, the behind plot is very big, right? So backstory is very big. There was a foreteller who talks about Oedipus before his birth, right, to his father. So Oedipus' father wanted Oedipus to be killed. The child is to be killed, right? When I mean, these are the plot behind that story, right? But Sophocles is very carefully handling that story, and he talks. I mean, he starts his epic from the point when that anagnorisis happened, right? Maybe like I'll explain what is anagnorisis, or you can take Hamlet as example. Hamlet, it has one unity of action, right? Maybe in Dr. Johnson, when he talks about the plays of Shakespeare, he praises Shakespeare for his Hamlet, right? Because Hamlet has the unity of action. Then unity of time, which means uh, when the action of a play should take a place within a single day. That is what unity of time is, right? And it is believed that when unity of time is followed, it helps to create a sense of realism, right? If the action of the play takes place over a long period of time, what happens then? It would be difficult for the audience to suspend their disbelief. Maybe for this reason, later Coleridge developed that willing suspension of disbelief. So during the time of Aristotle, there is no such ideas, right? So when the action takes place for a long period of time, what happens? There is a difficulty arises for the audience to suspend their disbelief and accept the events of the play as real. Then unity of time can help to create a sense of suspense and excitement, as unity of action does. If the audience knew that the action of the play was taking place over a single day, that would be more eager to see how the events of the play unfolded. If the action takes place for a long period of time, that suspense and excitement cannot happen, right? Maybe you can uh, think about Hamlet or Oedipus Rex again, once again. Then unity of place. Unity of place is just like a play should take place in a single location, right? And there is also a number of reasons for the unity of place justification. See, when there is unity of place, it helps to create a sense of realism again, because if the action of the play takes place in a single location, it is becoming easier for the audience to imagine themselves in the same place as the characters. Say, for example, if a war scene is happening on stage, if the whole play is about war, is one war, or if the whole play happens in a palace, it's a conversation between a few characters, right? If all the scenes of the play happens in a palace, it is easier for the audience to imagine themselves as being spectators in the palace, inside the palace, and watch their actions. So the understanding is becoming clear, right? So the unity of place create a sense of unity and harmony in the play, because if the action of the play takes place in a single location, it becomes easier for the writer first to create a sense of balance in the play's structure, as well as it also helps the audience to imagine themselves in the same place, right, as the characters are, right. So for that he makes all this structure of plot. Then he says, in a tragedy, emotions of pity and fear aroused, right. So what is necessary for a good tragic plot is it should arise emotion and pity, right. And in spectacular, a reader should get emotion and pity. So he says that a change of fortune may happen, right, and the change of fortune should happen not from bad to good. It should happen in reverse, like good to bad. Because if bad to good happens, what happens? People may have a different understanding that, like, right, if there is bad things, finally at the end we will be rewarded. That kind of misunderstanding may happen. So what Aristotle suggests is the emotion of pity and fear should happen through a change of fortune. That change of fortune should not be from bad to good, but in reverse it should happen from good to bad, because he feels like the unhappy ending is the only right ending for creating a most tragic effect. So even in 5th century BC, in Greece, there were playwrights who made a happy ending in their tragedy, right. It is not that Europeans prepared the tragic comedy first. They have introduced that, right. Even in some of the comedies in Greece, there are also records that they have also ended their works with the positive ending in order to make their audience their audience to, in order to prefer or offer the pleasure to their audience, they made this kind of ideas, right. Then he talks about the two ways in which the emotions are arised, right. He talks about two ways. One is by spectacular means or mere theatrical effects, and number two, the inner structure of a plot. With these two ideas, Aristotle suggests that the emotion of pity and fear can be raised. Spectacular means or mere theatrical effect means the physical torture or lamentation of characters, appearance of characters like beggars, right, or clowns, and many, right. So with these kind of spectacular means or theatrical effects, you can create emotion. You can take King Lear's shape, or the King Lear's figure, right, at the final scene of King Lear by Shakespeare. You can imagine, right. If you remember that King Lear's situation at the final scene, you will understand this, right. So just by the appearance of King Lear, we can get that pity and fear, right. So this is theatrical effect. Then he talks about the inner structure of plot. Inner structure of plot in the sense, like say for example, a brother unknowingly is killing his another brother, and finally discovering that fact later. Maybe Oedipus directs as example. He kills his own father in the beginning, and later he comes to an understanding. He happens to know that he killed his own father and married his mother, right. And for that he gets a reward, maybe for his action, or for that he gets a punishment, right. These are all the inner plot, inner structure of plot. So these ideas, Aristotle says that emotions can be created, emotions can be evoked. So for that he says a plot is divisible into two parts. One is complication, number two is unraveling or denouement. Denouement means conclusion. See, this is very simple to understand. He says that complication is the events into a tangled knot, which means in the beginning of a play, in the beginning of the argument, maybe on stage, what the playwright does is he makes lots of complicated ideas, and he prepares a knot, and later he tries to untie it one by one, right. He makes lots of knots into the story, and finally unties it. Again, you can take King Lear as example. In the beginning of the play, King Lear asks all the three daughters to tell him how much they love. So this is knot number one. When each daughter explains how they love their father, in each of their explanation, one knot is built. When Cordelia comes and explains, the third daughter, she makes a clear and untangled knot, and thereafter his fate works, right. Thereafter the tragedy begins. Till the end of the play, the knot is much tightened, and at the end of the middle, each knot prepared in the beginning, from the beginning, is untied, right? So this is complication. So the complication includes all the actions from the beginning to the point where it takes a turn for good or ill sometimes. Maybe you can take Shakespeare's Macbeth, right? Whenever he meets the witches, knots are built. Whenever he listens to his wife, knots are built. So it moved towards one good point or one ill point, then comes the denouement. The denouement means the conclusion or solution of a plot, right? So it extends from the turning point to the end. From where the point started uh, till the end, what is happening is the denouement. So the beginning, earlier one, the complication is commonly called as rising action, and denouement or unraveling is called normally called as falling action, right? So then he talks about the plot, right? How a plot should be. He says that a plot may be simple or a complex plot, but what Aristotle personally suggests is a complex plot is more popular. A complex plot is more clear to the audience, because in complex plot he makes there are two things appearing. One is peripetia and then anagnorisis. Peripetia means the reversal of situation. Peripetia, which means the reversal of situation, like um, um, like a deed which is done in the earlier life, maybe in the blindness, right? And it defeats its own purpose. Maybe like a move to kill an enemy which may recoil on one's own head, that is peripetia, right? And anagnorisis is a recognition, a discovery. Maybe here you can take Oedipus Rex as example. So in the beginning, what happens? The reversal of situation happens. Peripetia happens. It's a complex plot, right? Peripetia happens. Or you can take King Lear. In the beginning, what is the reason for King Lear's tragedy? The fate, right? The foolishness which he has done in the earlier time, right? And he wouldn't have called his daughters to tell about how much they love, right? How much they love their father. So that's a foolish thing, right? So that is peripetia. And anagnorisis is recognition, right? Why all this tragic flaw happened in his life. So a change from ignorance to knowledge is called anagnorisis, right? So both peripetia and anagnorisis, they give a pleasing element, because there is a concept of complex thing, and there is also a concept or an element of surprise in each of them. So peripetia and anagnorisis make a more complex plot, and that is suitable for a right tragedy. Then he talks about tragic hero, how a tragic hero should be. See, a tragic hero is a very important point, very important part in tragedy, right? Since tragedy aims at exciting pity and fear, its choice of hero is limited. So he cannot be an eminently good man, right? He is dropped down from his prosperity to adversity. If that is the plot, what happens? The whole undeserved sufferings arouses, and there won't be pity and fear, but there will be a feeling of shock, right? Hope you can understand, right? So when an eminently good person, right, is coming dropped from prosperity to adversity, what happens then? There won't be a pity and fear in the minds of audience. Instead of that, they get shock, right? They get revolt against. So he cannot be an eminently good man, and he cannot be a bad man, right? Bad man, like from adversity to prosperity, that should not also happen, because by the very badness he can neither excite pity and fear, nor he can deserve good fortune. Am I right? So we may start feeling like he would have good fortune, right? The audience may get that kind of feel. And he cannot be an utter villain, because the fall is matters, right? Because his fall is a matter for gratification. Audience will not get pity and fear, and they will want that utter villain to be dead, or they will. The audience will automatically will get a feel like they wanted the villain to die, or they will want the villain to get into that adversity, right? So there remains but one kind of character who can best satisfy the requirement. That is a man who is not eminently good, right, and whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or other thing, but some error or frailty. So this is where we can justify that King Lear by Shakespeare is the finest tragedy, because King Lear is not an eminently good man, He's not a villain. He's not a bad man. The misfortune happens because of the error he had made, he had created, right? He had created for himself. So fate worked there. So this is what a tragic hero must be. This is how a tragic hero must be. Then he dedicated few chapters for comedy. While he is talking about comedy, he says that it is originated from satire, and for the comedy character, he says that not wicked or vicious, but the writer should choose men who have some defect which is not painful or destructive, right? Because pleasure arises from the general foible, right? He says that characters which are worse than the average, right, what will happen, some defect or ugliness which is not painful or destructive should be the plot of a tragedy or a tragic character, comic character. So what they do is defective or ugly, they are provoking laughter, right? But they are not leading to harm, right? Or they are not leading to any pain. And here Aristotle tries to explain why comedy is an acceptable form, where when Plato says that heterogeneous feelings are wrongly evoked in comedy, Aristotle suggests that the characters are performing with the sole reason, that is, in order to make laughter among the audience. So a character gets beaten by the other characters with the sole reason that the audience should get laughter. So there is no chance for pity there. Or wrongly evoking of heterogeneous feel, the right feel is evoked. So this is how Aristotle justifies tragedy, right? Finally, when Aristotle talks about comedy, he shares that the generalizing power of poetry. He says that comedy is the generalizing power of poetry. So it equally represents not what has happened, but what may happen. That's what he says, that comedy should talk about the general foible, right? The pleasure should arise from general foible. Very general actions of characters should be concentrated on comedy. Then he talks about epic. Much of the points are already discussed. He says that natural and form of epic is from the songs for God, which were sung in the old hymns, and an epic should also have a turning point, a complication and denouement, which he suggested for tragedy. And unlike tragedy, epic has no limitation, right? And it resembles tragedy by imitating serious action, and it is very greater in length because there is no limit for epic. An epic writer can write any number of lines. And what is done in epic is a probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities, which means a poet should prefer a probable impossibilities into a probable possibilities, which means he can take or he can talk about any believable false to the unbelievable truth. So that makes a convincing fact, right? You can talk about a convincing lie to an unconvincing fact, because he says that the difference between epic and tragedy is the use of improbable or any other kind of marvelous ideas, right? So here poets are tempted to use these kind of elements because they are more pleasing, right? They are greater in scope, right? Epic has more scope than tragedy because there is no limitation, and any kind of imagination can be explained. It can be whatever a poet perceives through eye, he can imagine that and brings as verses in poetry. So then he talks about the difference between epic and tragedy. So as I have already mentioned, tragedy has limitation, epic has no limitation. And of all discussing all these points, Aristotle comes to a conclusion that tragedy is superior of the two because it has an immediate appeal and it has more memory-filled ideas. It is creating more memory-filled ideas in the audience, right? Because the appeal that tragedy creates is much greater than the epic, right? And it attains its end more perfectly than epic, right? There must be a proper end an artist should have when he creates a tragedy or when he creates an epic, right? So this end is properly attained, right? When in terms of epic and tragedy, that is much properly attained in tragedy than epic. Then he talks about style, where he says what kind of words would be preferred, right, for different style. He says that unfamiliar words or creating dignity and charm. And the old words, archaic words like dialect words, newly coined words can create surprise and novelty in writing, right? And metaphorical use of words, and they are good for drama, right? For epic, he suggests unfamiliar words can be taken, right? And finally, compound words can be taken for lyric, right? So with a lot of ideas, he says these type of words can be chosen, right? And he lays two essential points for good writing. One is clearness, number one. Then the next thing is propriety, that is the character of ideas, right? A writer should have a a clearness in his words and propriety, how he presents it, right? So for that, he suggests all these types of words. So as I have already mentioned, Plato's approach to literature is different from Aristotle, because Plato's life was different, Aristotle's life was different. Plato approached literature as a social reformer, whereas Aristotle expected art to be more than what it is, just an art, right? So, as I mentioned in the beginning, uh, the art for art's sake or art for life's sake, these two different uh, uh, discussion have been started with this great two eminent writers, Plato and Aristotle. So since we are running out of time, I happen to make my lecture so fast. So far we have discussed the legacy of the classical literary criticism, especially on focusing the works of Plato and Aristotle. We have seen how their ideas about literature have influenced the thoughts and culture for so many centuries. Maybe in our next lecture, we'll continue this. We'll discuss the Roman classics, the Latin classics, and their contribution in literary criticism. We'll also see how Roman and Latin criticism built uh, 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 the, the unique perspective on literature, and they made the classical understanding, right? And they paved way for classical understanding to the neoclassicists in European writing.
Thank you, John sir. I think if the participants has any doubts or clarifications to be made, the arena is open. I can see few people were raising their hands in between the lecture. You can make use of this opportunity, and the comment box is turned on for anyone who wanted to ask any queries to the resource person. Yes, Agalya Nagarajan, you can unmute yourself and can talk with the resource person. Thank you, John sir. We have received a handful of appreciations and feedbacks in the comment box. Also, I have shared the feedback form in the chat box. Thank you, John sir, for giving us for having given us a valuable suggestion